In 1923, Germany experienced the fastest currency collapse ever recorded. This was not gradual inflation, it was total monetary system failure. Prices doubled every few days, then every day, then every few hours. By November, money lost value faster than people could spend it. $1 reached 4.2 trillion German marks at the peak. No modern currency collapse has ever matched this speed or scale. Not Zimbabwe, not Venezuela, not Hungary. Those collapses were destructive, but Weimar was different. It happened to a fully industrialized, educated Western power. It happened to a nation that had been a global economic leader just 10 years prior. This terrifies economists more than any other historical event. It proves that sophisticated systems are not immune to simple math. Workers were paid twice daily to outrun price increases. They threw bundles of cash out of factory windows to family members below. Those family members ran to shops immediately. If they waited an hour, the money became worthless. Savings built over decades were erased in weeks. Life insurance policies became worth less than the stamp on the envelope. But this was not war damage. It was not rebellion, invasion, or a natural disaster. The war had already ended when the currency collapsed. Germany still had factories, workers, and infrastructure. The chimney stacks were standing, the trains were running, the workforce was skilled. What failed was the financial structure holding it all together. The collapse came from arithmetic, not chaos. This video explains exactly why the system became unfixable. Most history books focus on the wheelbarrows of cash. They focus on the photos of children playing with bundles of money. I'm going to show you the calculation most explanations skip. Not stories or photos, but the math that made collapse inevitable. Once these numbers crossed key thresholds, policy stopped mattering. To understand the trillions, you must look at the millions. The collapse began 9 years before the crisis. It began in 1914. When World War I started, nations had two choices for funding. They could tax their citizens, or they could borrow money. Britain chose to tax. France chose to tax. Germany chose to borrow. The Kaiser and his generals made a calculated gamble. They believed the war would be short. They believed Germany would win quickly. They planned to pay off the debt using the wealth of defeated nations. They expected the losers to pay the bill. Because of this assumption, Germany suspended the gold standard immediately. They unlinked the mark from physical gold reserves. This allowed the government to print money without restriction. During the war, the amount of cash in circulation quadrupled. But prices did not quadruple. The government used strict price controls and rationing. They hid the inflation artificially. The German people did not see the danger. They saw high wages and a functioning war machine. But the math was rotting from the inside. By 1918, Germany had not won quickly. They had lost slowly. The gamble had failed completely. The debt remained, but the repayment capacity disappeared. There were no reparations from defeated enemies to pay the bills. Instead, Germany was the defeated enemy. Government liabilities dwarfed any realistic future tax base. This was the first structural failure point. The foundation of the currency was already destroyed before the treaty was signed. The illusion of stability remained only because the war ended. After the war, Germany looked damaged but still functional. Shops opened, wages were paid, and trade continued. This surface stability delayed the recognition of deeper failure. Currency collapses rarely begin with panic or violence. They begin quietly inside government balance sheets. Then came the Treaty of Versailles. The Allies imposed massive reparations on Germany. The total was eventually set at 132 billion gold marks. This figure was staggering. It was roughly triple the size of the entire German economy. But the amount was not the main problem. The currency was the problem. Reparations were not payable in German paper marks. The Allies knew the paper mark was weak. They demanded payment in gold or foreign currency. They demanded coal, timber, and steel. This created a deadly mismatch inside the system. Germany earned revenue in paper marks from taxes, but it owed debts in gold to the Allies. To pay the debt, the government had to sell paper marks to buy foreign currency. This is simple supply and demand. When you sell massive amounts of a currency, its price drops. As the mark weakened, reparations grew harder to pay. If the mark dropped by 50%, the cost of buying gold doubled. The government had to sell twice as many marks to make the same payment. This selling pushed the mark down further. A feedback loop formed with no exit. The more they paid, the less the money was worth. The less the money was worth, the more they had to print to buy gold. The arithmetic made solvency impossible. Germany also faced collapsing tax revenues. Technical point, but important. In a normal economy, taxes fund the government. In an inflationary economy, taxes fail. There is a time lag between earning money and paying tax on it. In stable times, a 3-month delay doesn't matter. In 1922, a 3-month delay was fatal. By the time the government collected taxes, the money had lost value. Real tax receipts fell to a fraction of what was needed. The state budget deficit exploded. The government could not cut spending. They had to pay pensions to war widows. They had to pay wages to civil servants. They had to pay for social programs to prevent communist revolution. The expenses were rigid. The income was vaporizing. So, the government printed money to fill the gap. The mechanism was specific. The government issued bonds. The Reichsbank, the central bank, bought those bonds with newly printed cash. This monetized the debt directly. There were no effective limits on issuance. At first, inflation appeared manageable and even useful. It reduced the real value of domestic debt. It made German exports cheaper to the rest of the world. Industry boomed briefly. Unemployment vanished. Politicians mistook this phase for stability. They called it the catastrophe boom. But inflation is deceptive in its early stages. It hides damage instead of preventing it. It consumes the capital of the nation to keep the engine running. Germany was selling its assets to buy time. As inflation rose, human behavior began to change. This is where the math meets psychology. Economists call this the velocity of money. It measures how fast money changes hands. In 1920, Germans still trusted their currency. They held on to money, hoping prices would stabilize. This low velocity kept inflation lower than the printing rate. But by 1922, trust evaporated. People realized the money would never recover. They stopped saving and started spending immediately. If you were paid at noon, you spent it by 1 p.m. Money velocity increased across the entire economy. This accelerated price increases further. Inflation stopped being linear and became exponential. It wasn't just that there was more money, it was that nobody wanted to hold it. The demand for cash fell to zero. Businesses shortened contracts and repriced constantly. Shops raised prices multiple times per day. Restaurants stopped printing prices on menus. Waiters would stand on tables and read out new prices every 30 minutes. Money ceased to function as a store of value. That alone signals currency death. A currency that cannot store value is just paper. Meanwhile, reparations remained fixed and unavoidable. Germany could not inflate its way out of them. Printing more marks made external payments harder. The system consumed itself with each attempt to comply. In January 1923, the crisis went terminal. Germany defaulted on a shipment of telephone poles and coal. France and Belgium lost patience. They invaded the Ruhr region. This was the industrial heartland of Germany. It produced 80% of the country's coal and steel. The French aimed to extract reparations by force. The German government ordered passive resistance. They told workers to stop working. Factories closed. Coal mines shut down. Trains stopped. But the government promised to keep paying the workers. This was the final mathematical breakage. Germany was now paying millions of workers to produce nothing. Supply dropped to near zero. Money supply went to infinity. With no taxes and no production, printing exploded. Money issuance moved from billions to trillions rapidly. Printing presses ran 24 hours a day. They could not print notes fast enough. They started printing on one side of the paper to save ink. Towns started printing their own emergency money on leather, wood, and silk. Soon the numbers reached quadrillions. At this point, hyperinflation fully ignited. Prices doubled every few days, then every day. Eventually, prices doubled within hours. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January cost 200 billion marks in November. Currency could no longer serve any function. Shops refused marks and demanded goods instead. A haircut cost 2 eggs. A cinema ticket cost a lump of coal. Foreign currency became the only real money inside Germany. Barter returned in urban economies. Pensions were destroyed almost completely. Fixed incomes became impossible to survive on. The middle class was wiped out fastest. The wealthy had assets like land and factories. The poor had nothing to lose. The middle class had savings, bonds, and bank accounts. Those accounts became worth nothing. A lifetime of work bought a cup of coffee. Asset holders and debtors benefited disproportionately. A man who borrowed 5 million marks to buy a house in 1921 could pay off his mortgage in 1923 for the price of a newspaper. Wealth redistributed violently through inflation. Society tore itself apart. This speed is what made Weimar unique. Other inflations destroy slowly over years. Rome took a century to debase the denarius. Weimar destroyed value faster than systems could adapt. Contracts failed before they could be renegotiated. Wages lagged hours behind prices, not months. Trust vanished before institutions could respond. This is why Weimar remains the worst collapse. The exchange rate shows the scale clearly. In 1914, $1 bought 4.2 marks. By 1921, it bought 190 marks. By late 1922, it bought 7,400 marks. In November 1923, it bought 4.2 trillion marks. Here's what I checked to verify these claims. Reichsbank balance sheets from 1921 to 1923. Daily exchange rate data against the US dollar. Government price indices showing rapid price doubling. Business records showing intraday price changes. This data confirms the collapse was unprecedented. The Reichsbank did not act independently. It monetized government deficits directly. Currency became a political survival tool. Once limits vanished, value became arbitrary. Central banks fail currencies when constraints disappear. Stabilization only came after total collapse. In November 1923, the government introduced the Rentenmark. This was a new currency, but Germany had no gold to back it. They had no foreign reserves, so they backed it with a lie that became true. They claimed the currency was backed by the agricultural land of Germany. This was theoretically impossible. You cannot exchange a paper note for a piece of a farm. But the psychological trick worked. People believed the land had value. Therefore, they believed the money had value. Crucially, the government stopped printing. They cut the budget deficit ruthlessly. They fired thousands of civil servants. They stopped paying passive resistance wages in the Ruhr. Fiscal discipline returned only after promises vanished. One Rentenmark was exchanged for 1 trillion old marks. The zeros were deleted. Prices stabilized almost overnight. It was called the miracle of the Rentenmark, but it was not a miracle. It was the return of arithmetic. Supply was limited. Confidence was restored. The feedback loop was broken. Hyperinflation ended, but damage remained. Savings were never restored. The middle class never forgave the government. Trust in democratic institutions was permanently weakened. Voters looked for radical solutions. They looked for leaders who promised to tear up the system. Political radicalization followed economic trauma. Only 10 years later, that radicalization destroyed Europe. Weimar's lesson is often misunderstood. This was not incompetence or madness alone. It was arithmetic colliding with reality. Liabilities grew faster than the economy could support. External constraints met internal promises. Once crossed, outcomes stopped being optional. Modern economies are larger and more complex, but the arithmetic of money has not changed. Debt, deficits, and trust still interact. Currency collapse begins quietly, then suddenly. Weimar shows what happens when limits fail. That is why it remains the worst in history.